Assisting victims and survivors of crime is complex. The cases are layered with legal, emotional, and financial consequences. To handle these cases well, a provider must have competence and flexibility in many areas. But no one can be expert in all areas. So, part of competence is knowing your limits and knowing when to bring others into your cases. An example of this complexity is seen in the story of Belinda Dura and her victim specialist, Sue.
Sue is an FBI victim specialist. She's been working with Belinda Dura, a soldier who was one of the first women in the military to provide convoy security. Belinda served in multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. During the last tour of duty, she saw 3 fellow soldiers die in roadside bombings. Not long after Belinda returned to the States, she got a bank statement showing that she'd been approved for an equity line of credit that she never applied for. While she was overseas, she had become the victim of identity theft. The FBI began investigating the case, and Sue started helping Belinda with resources. She also keeps Belinda up to date on the investigation. Lately, Sue has stepped in to help the investigator because Belinda hasn't been returning his phone calls. When Sue tried to reach Belinda at work, she was informed that Belinda was out of work for more than a week. When Sue finally reaches her at home, Belinda says that she's just overwhelmed with her life and has a hard time just getting out of bed. Before Sue gets off the phone, she tells Belinda that she's concerned about her and would like to explore some options for help.
While Sue is competent to help Belinda with her rights as a victim of identity theft, she's not equipped to help Belinda resolve more serious mental health struggles. One of the signs that Sue is a competent professional is her willingness to know when she needs to refer her client to someone with different expertise. Competency Standard 3.2 says that the victim assistance provider helps victims and survivors identify appropriate resources. This includes the provider's ability to recognize signs of conditions that influence victim and survivor vulnerability. Symptoms such as anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. And Competency Standard 2.1 says that the victim assistance provider coordinates with an array of individuals and organizations to address the needs of victims and survivors.
It is the responsibility of someone who is dealing or working with a crime victim to understand the do's and don'ts in the field. And if you don't know, for example, the Victim's Bill of Rights and the rights of a victim, you're doing a disservice. They are counting on you because they're new to the system. A lot of crime victims have no clue about the criminal justice system and going through the court system as a whole. And if you don't know, you can't serve that crime victim.
As crime victim ombudsman in South Carolina, Hope Blackley heard many complaints from victims and survivors.
One of the instances was from a mom whose son was murdered and was upset that she wasn't notified of a bond hearing, and so I investigated that complaint and found out that the jail notified her because of being uneducated in the field of victims' rights and advocacy, stated, well, the victim was dead, so there was nobody to contact. What a travesty and a detriment, because that she wanted her time in court to speak.
Oftentimes I will experience victim services providers who are very familiar with what they believe to be their responsibilities within their agencies, but are not familiar with what the rights are or how a victim would exercise those rights. Their rights should be as important to us in notifying them of those rights and allowing them to exercise those rights as the rights of the defendant are to the legal, to the law enforcement side.
Crime has been with us forever, and there are cycles to crime. Different kinds of crimes change with developing technology and so forth. And so what we are doing is being very reactive. When something new comes down the pike, we create a new response to it when it becomes a crisis. And good change management means that we are prepared before something becomes a crisis. And the standards can help people develop flexibility and the ability to sort of turn on a dime and respond to new things without feeling overwhelmed by them, because they have a structure.
And competence is what says I'm providing the best services possible to a crime victim. And to do anything less is to run the risk of potentially hurting a crime victim.
Sexual assault survivors run up against a lot of barriers that will keep them from seeking services. Professionals really need to meet the survivor where they are, and that involves being competent to serve them.
In addition to guidelines for standards in competency programs and ethics, the model standard suggests guiding values for the field. One of the guiding values is respect for people's rights and dignity. Victim assistance providers are aware of cultural, individual, and role differences. Victim assistance providers try to identify their own biases and to limit the effect of these biases on their work.
It's a fact of life that as the world demographics change and as people move about the world with greater ease, that the diversity of crime victims that present themselves to you is going to increase. The burden becomes how, when a new culture or an unfamiliar culture is presented to me for my services, how do I make my services flexible enough to where I can be of assistance to a person irrespective of where they come from?
Another challenge to competence is blurring of professional relationship boundaries.
Particularly if you're involved in responding to them at the scene, at the hospital, shortly after the victimization. So that sort of sets the stage for you potentially to feel that your relationship is different than another provider's relationship might be. So what may happen is the victim may reach out to you for things that are outside of your purview of expertise, outside of your purview of services that you would typically provide to a victim of crime.
Competency Standard 1.1 says that the victim assistance provider follows legal, ethical, and behavioral standards of conduct in the helping relationship. This includes respecting the boundaries for your role and distinguishing personal from professional responses. It also encourages promoting empowerment for victims and survivors rather than rescuing them.
Am I planting the seeds so that they have the appropriate social support network that they're going to need down the road? I'm not doing that if I'm doing everything for them.
And it's our responsibility to use the standards to make sure that everyone is trained to be able to appropriately respond, because for some survivors that are reaching out for the first time, if they have a really negative interaction, even if it wasn't with the direct service staff, but somebody else affiliated with the organization, they may be more reluctant to reach out in the future.